This is the war in Russia through the eyes of Otto Carius, one of Germany's most distinguished tank commanders. In this episode, Carius is deployed to the Ruhr. Let's begin. The trip to Berlin went without incident. I stayed at the apartment of the SS officer who had given me a ride in his vehicle. The first thing the next morning, I headed for the Army Personnel Office. I wanted to extract marching orders to my old company from them. Even though I left my old man's walking stick outside the door, just like I had when visiting Himmler, I didn't succeed in realizing an immediate transfer to my old unit at the front. I wanted to circumvent the replacement battalion, but the staff officers were inflexible. They dismissed me politely but firmly. I took the train back to my hospital in Westphalia. The hospital was no longer in Lingen. That was because I had arranged to have myself transferred to a hospital in the area where my uncle was the chief surgeon. I was hoping to be able to achieve more there. At the same time, I was practically among family. I had been told to send a telegram before my arrival, but they didn't know me very well if they really hoped I would do that. The sister in charge of the kitchen had baked me a 3-layered cake, and we celebrated together in an intimate atmosphere. During my stay in both of the hospitals, I had become acquainted with the food provided by the nuns. I must say that all the wounded were enthusiastic about the rations. For example, even for Christmas in 1944, every hospital patient received half a chicken. Mark my words, every wounded man, and not just the officers, as spiteful people like to claim. The wonderful sisters performed superhuman feats. The hospital, as can be imagined, was overfilled. My uncle operated practically around the clock. The party functionaries in the area insisted on sponsoring an official celebration for me in the movie theater. They intended to invite the public to it. I told them right away that such events didn't interest me at all, especially since everyone really had other worries at that point in the war. No one should count on my appearing. The hero's ceremony was thus held on a small scale in an adjoining room of an inn. Only my fellow soldiers from the hospital and the friends of my uncle were present. The district leader also appeared with his following, but he left the gathering in a conspicuous manner after I had finished making my thank you speech. I shouldn't fail to mention that I had given an overview of the situation from my perspective in my speech. In the meantime, the enemy had come closer and closer to the western borders of the Reich. By December, we could see fully packed cars in Westphalia that had supposedly pulled back from the front. The men were usually so excited when reporting that one would think that the Americans were already just a few kilometers away. Of course, we had our own thoughts on the matter. Where was all of that supposed to lead? If all of the stragglers on the Western Front had moved back this far, then the Allies would soon be reaching the Rhine. In the meantime, the western districts had already been evacuated. I took advantage of the opportunity to visit my mother one more time for a little while after Christmas and helped her save a few things from home. On the return trip, I made another detour to Berlin. I checked to see whether there was any opportunity to get to East Prussia. My old company had landed there in the meantime. I had written to my comrades that I could walk quite well again and had been feeling strong enough to go to the front for some time, but that I had been hindered in doing so by the replacement battalion. On December 2nd, I received the following reply. Herr Lieutenant, with your wound, you can really consider yourself lucky that you are still among the living and don't have to be left out at the next census. When can we count on seeing you again in the company? It goes without saying that that would be the greatest Christmas present for the company. Of course, I thought the same thing as my terrific comrades. It upset me when the Army Personnel Office informed me that no more opportunities existed to get to East Prussia. The troops there were being brought back. It would thus be completely senseless to send me there. Instead, I was supposed to report to Paderborn. In the units that were being drawn up, they were missing officers with frontline experience. I would find a satisfying assignment there. I was very disappointed, of course, and quickly visited my brother, who was taking an officer candidate course in Krampnitz. When I arrived there, excitement was in the air. All the men in the course were getting ready to move to occupy the positions around Berlin. I was lucky because the next day I wouldn't have seen my brother anymore. It should be mentioned that the Russians had already surfaced a few days before at Kustrin. Hauptmann Fromme had quickly assembled a battalion out of all the available training tanks. If I had just shown up a day earlier, I would have been able to take over a company immediately, because no suitable officer had been available. Hauptmann Fromme was a tough old soldier, whom I already knew from earlier times. It was said that he had been demoted in peacetime because he had struck a commander due to a difference of opinion while under the influence of alcohol. This old go-getter had become an officer again during the war, starting at the bottom. By 1941, he had already received the Knight's Cross. Fromme showed the Russians at Kustrin that the way to Berlin wasn't yet quite all the way open. He shot up the Russian armored advance guard and thus prevented the Russians from obtaining the Oder crossings by surprise. At the hospital, I packed my suitcase quickly and left, as ordered, for Paderborn. The commander of the replacement battalion at Paderborn wanted to palm off a training company on me right away. I told him that I didn't feel confident with the training of a 300-man company. I wanted to be transferred to a combat unit that was being drawn up. He then became unpleasant. I remembered the correspondence that Himmler had given me. When I presented it to him, he abandoned his intentions, but then I had to wait around without doing anything until something suitable was found. The 3rd Company of the 502nd under Hauptmann Leonhard had been pulled out of Russia and was in Sennelager. The company had received the new King Tigers and was getting ready for combat. I saw my maintenance team there, along with Oberfeldwebel Delzeit, who continued to lead it with his old vigor. I also saw old familiar faces in the combat elements. Oberfeldwebel Zwedi was there as a tank commander and Lieutenant Ruidel as a platoon leader. How happy it would have made me to have been transferred to my old gang, because there was still hope that this company would be shipped back to the battalion on the Eastern Front. The commander of the replacement battalion ruined those plans, however. He was just about through with me. By then, everything had already gone completely crazy. Everyone in the replacement battalion lived according to the questionable motto, "Enjoy the war, the peace will be terrible." This dissoluteness and all the senseless partying according to the principle of après nous le déluge was deeply repugnant to me. I wasn't the only one who thought that about the way they carried on, but our circle was relatively small. In any case, it was clear to me that I wouldn't stay long in Paderborn. The catastrophe was already casting its bitter shadows. Hauptmann Scheer was the commander of the 512th Hunting Tiger Battalion. I was grateful to him for accepting me as a company commander. I had to disappoint the wounded from my old company. Although these men were lying around doing nothing, their transfer to the front was strictly forbidden by the commander of the replacement battalion. I regretted not being able to keep those men whom I knew and who were so tried and true. After a great deal of effort, I at least got Lustig as my personal driver. Our equipment situation was quite complicated. The hunting tigers came from the Hindenburg facilities in St. Valentin near Linz. The cannons, on the other hand, came from Breslau. The Russians had already advanced beyond that, however, so we were only able to equip 30 hunting tigers with cannons. Each company received only 10 vehicles. In the final analysis, that was sufficient since we couldn't man anymore. The ammunition was drawn from Magdeburg. The ammunition details that picked it up had radios with them to report every stop. Our employment was that important to the High Command. The tanks were transported by rail to Paderborn. The companies were assembled there in Sennelager. We had the impression that we were considered the secret weapon that could still save Germany. Because the vehicle parts were stockpiled in Dollersheim near Vienna, I had to commute the 1,000 kilometers between Paderborn and Vienna on a continuous basis. That wasn't a lot of fun in the dark and with the constant air raids. Although I drove with blackout lights, we had a lot of problems with the civilian population, which felt threatened. But how could I have covered that stretch if I had stopped for every air raid and waited for the all-clear signal? In Kassel, I once again had a lot of luck while making such a trip. We were in the middle of the city when the sirens suddenly started wailing. Everybody ran into the air raid shelter. My first sergeant, who unfortunately bore no resemblance to Hauptfeldwebel Rieger, wanted to get out of the vehicle at all costs and disappear into a bunker. I didn't allow him to dissuade me and stepped on the gas to get to the edge of the city. We scarcely had the railroad crossing behind us when the bombs of our liberators were rushing through the air. Fortunately, the carpet bombing began farther to our right. The entire portion of the city where the first sergeant wanted to get out lay in ruins. Once again, I had had a sixth sense and was greatly relieved not to have paid attention to the requests of my Hauptfeldwebel. When the assault guns were calibrated in Sennelager, we experienced our first failure. Despite its 82 tons, our hunting tiger didn't want to act like we wanted it to. Only its armor was satisfactory. Its maneuverability left a lot to be desired. In addition, it was an assault gun. There was no traversing turret, just an enclosed armored housing. Any large traversing of the cannon had to be affected by the movement of the entire vehicle. Because of that, transmissions and steering differentials were soon out of order. That such a monstrosity had to be constructed in the final phase of the war, of all times. A better idea for the travel lock of the 8-meter-long cannon of our hunting tiger was also absolutely necessary. It had to be removed from the outside during contact with the enemy. Locking down the barrel during a road march was necessary, of course. Otherwise, the mounting brackets would have been worn out too quickly, and exact aiming would have been impossible. All these problems were compounded by the fact that a tanker cannot feel comfortable in an assault gun. We want to be able to turn our weapons 360 degrees. If not, we have no feeling of security or superiority, but rather that someone is breathing down our necks. During the calibration, Stabsgefreiter Sepp Moser set up the targets in the countryside. From Passau, he was a man with a powerful body and a heart of gold. He was with the maintenance squad that had been withdrawn from Russia with the 3rd Company of our battalion and reorganized in Paderborn. Whenever Sepp took matters in hand, things worked. Moser drove a prime mover. In civilian life, on the other hand, he drove a beer truck. His wife took care of his correspondence with the laconic remark that otherwise the pen would break in his hands. I heard from another comrade who saw Sepp again after the war in Passau that he was content. He proudly noted that he got 30 liters of beer free every week. The comrade then asked him in amazement what he was able to do with all that beer. He received a classic reply to that question: "Well, whatever I still need, I just have to buy for myself." Sepp Moser gave it his all during the calibration of the assault guns. We missed everything in such a manner that we were soon fed up with it. Finally, the ordnance technician checked the matter out, and everything then worked better. We discovered that the cannon, because of its enormous length, was battered about so much as a result of even a short move off the road that its alignment no longer agreed with that of the optics. That promised to be a lot of fun. Things didn't want to work before we even met the enemy. My company was the first to be loaded. On the last night, I gave my soldiers an evening pass and was both amazed and overjoyed that no one was missing in the morning. Our goal was the train station in Siegburg. The almost panicky haste was understandable. We knew that the Americans had already crossed the Rhine at Remagen, after the bridge had fallen into their hands intact. In spite of the total chaos that already prevailed then, we had all of our things complete and together. That was an accomplishment all the same. 3 transport trains had been made available. The loading went according to plan because the enemy Air Force spared the train station in Sennelager for some unknown reason, although all our assault guns were assembled there. I preferred to drive in my vehicle to check out the new operational area before the arrival of my company. Due to the low-flying aircraft, of course, the transports only rolled at night. Using the Kubel, I had to drive up and down the rail line constantly so that the trains didn't get held up too long. The tracks were frequently interdicted by the fighter bombers, which were a nuisance. There was hardly any air defense anymore. Besides, a strange attitude was prevalent. It could be summed up as follows: "Do anything but shoot. The pilots could discover our position." The ease with which the enemy fighters circled over us in broad daylight made me furious. We had no way to defend ourselves against them, however. The air superiority of the enemy was simply devastating. Because of that, during the day our trains stayed in tunnels or along protective slopes where they weren't exactly safe. The field mess hadn't shown up yet, so I had to be a jack of all trades: driver, courier, transportation officer, and company commander, depending on the situation. Occasionally I could even get warm food for my men. Fuel and rations were readily available in the depots. They either fell into the hands of the Americans or were senselessly destroyed. When I finally knew for certain that the first transport would arrive in Siegburg in the morning, I drove ahead. I found out that the Yanks were already shooting as far as the loading ramp. That meant it could get lively. In Siegburg, after a long search, I found a former commander of the 502nd, Major Schmidt. He led the Armor Liaison staff in the West and was more than a little surprised to see me there. I actually had to sit down when Major Schmidt told me that he had no idea what was supposed to happen to us and where we were supposed to be employed. Then even crazier things happened. For instance, one of my motorcycle messengers appeared and proudly informed me that our first train was in the process of unloading in Duisburg. It was supposed to have gone to Siegburg, and it landed up in Duisburg. There had to be something fishy going on. I ordered the messenger to squeeze everything possible out of his machine so that he reached Duisburg before the empty train left again. Where was I supposed to get the special cars needed to load the vehicles again? The motorcycle messenger was able to get there, and the train in fact reached the area around Siegburg the next night. In the meantime, Major Schmidt had called around to all possible units and staffs. Even the commander of Army Group B, General Feldmarschall Model, didn't know about our planned employment in his area. I was ordered to report to him after the arrival of my vehicles. While waiting, I wanted to finally get some sleep. After all, who knew when I would get some peace and quiet again? I was just lying down on my wooden bed when a guard appeared and reported Oberleutnant Held to me. That was it for the sleep. Held was my platoon leader when I was a recruit. I hadn't seen him since 1941. I was very happy to be able to shoot the breeze with an old acquaintance. We talked the entire night. We couldn't unload in Siegburg because of the very heavy fire. We therefore let the first train stay in a tunnel until the onset of darkness and brought the vehicles onto the road during the night. Not a single wheeled vehicle was ready for action. All the tires had been shot up, and it took days until we had the supply trucks halfway in order. Intervention at Remagen was no longer a possibility because the Americans had already advanced across the Autobahn. The Yanks must have been really grateful to Hitler for creating these superhighways. If only we had found such roads during our advance into Russia. We then would have reached Moscow and not have remained stuck in the mud. At that point, I was attached to General Bayerlein. I had the first platoon occupy positions in a little patch of woods right behind the front lines. I myself scarcely sat in a combat vehicle anymore because the individual assault guns were attached across the entire corps sector. I constantly drove from platoon to platoon, from hunting tiger to hunting tiger, and from regiment to direct the engagements. Soon the distances weren't very big anymore because the Ruhr pocket collapsed more and more upon itself. An incident occurred that proved to me how deeply the fighting morale among the men and the officers had sunk. My executive officer was pulling security in my hunting tiger in the piece of woods already mentioned. He had also taken my crew. Suddenly my driver Lustig approached me on foot halfway from the front lines. I already had a bad feeling. The good man was completely out of breath and had to catch it first before he could report to me what had happened. His first remark said everything. I almost slugged my tank commander just now. If we were still in Russia, he'd be dead now. He then explained what had happened. His vehicle was located with another hunting tiger, well camouflaged at the wood line. A long column of enemy tanks had driven across their front at about 1.5 kilometers distance. Lustig now considered it a given that the tank commander would give the order to fire. Why else were our assault guns there? The man refused to fire a shot, however. A heated argument started among the members of the crew. This strange officer justified his refusal to fire with the reason that he would expose himself if he opened fire, and he would then draw the attention of the fighter bombers. To make a long story short, not a single shot was actually fired, although this distance was practically ideal for our cannons. The enemy would have had no opportunity to endanger our hunting tigers. It wasn't enough, however, that this strange officer didn't fire. He also ordered his vehicle to back up out of the woods shortly thereafter. It was then that he really did reveal his position. He was lucky that no planes were in the air at that time. He cleared out to the rear without notifying the vehicle commander of the second hunting tiger at all. That commander promptly followed, and both of them raced off as if the devil were behind them. Of course, no enemy was to be seen far and wide. Because of the careless driving of the completely inexperienced crew, the second vehicle was immediately disabled. The fearless Oberleutnant didn't worry about the vehicle at all. On the contrary, he obstinately drove on until his vehicle also became disabled. At least the Oberfeldwebel in the second assault gun blew up his own vehicle. Lustig had then departed on foot and insisted that I forward his report to the battalion. In that phase of the war, however, it didn't make any sense anymore. Everyone had to decide for themselves whether they wanted to experience the end decently or as a louse. Troops from all different branches were lying about in the woods by the hundreds and waiting for the end. Their morale was completely gone. In Siegen, I went to my battalion staff to report the situation to my commander. As I entered the command post, I was congratulated from all sides. The rumor had gone around, so it seems, that my guys had knocked out about 40 enemy tanks. I sobered them up when I made it known that we hadn't knocked out a single Yank, and we had 2 complete losses to show for it. Had only 2 or 3 tank commanders and crews from my company in Russia been there with me, then the rumor could have easily been true. All of my old comrades would have enjoyed firing up those Yanks on parade. 5 Russians were, after all, more dangerous than 30 Americans. We had already noticed that in the few days we had been employed in the West. In the meantime, it had become clear to us that we were completely encircled. The Ruhr pocket had been formed. Feldmarschall Model wanted to break through with all his forces at Marburg and escape the encirclement while there was still time. That would not have been difficult at all. The Supreme Command had a different opinion, however, and ordered us to hold out in the pocket for as long as possible. Our withdrawal route followed the Sieg River through Eitorf-Betzdorf-Kirchen. The first objective was Siegen, which was supposed to be held for a long time. A few assault guns had already become disabled on the road march. Despite good intentions, the inexperienced drivers were not able to master the situation in the mountainous terrain. The men really had a good attitude, but they had neither experience with heavy vehicles nor enough training. This concludes the 26th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.